the higher self versus the lower self. So, to make it really simple, you could think of the lower self as selfish, and you could think of the higher self as selfless, right? And when we do spiritual work, um, typically what is taught is to try to work on your ego. And the ego is a belief in the self, and it is something that so because of that belief in that self, it the ego also sort of controls the way that the thoughts are basically all self-centered in a sort of way. So self-centered thinking you can think of as the lower self's thinking behavior. Um, it's self-remembrance in a way. It's always like it calls up the self belief as a central part of the rest of the way you think about the world. Okay. Now, with the higher self, there can still be thoughts happening, but it's not self centered. And you kind of lose yourself in the higher self. Okay. So you could think of the lower self as the self, and you could think of the higher self as the no self. It's another way you could look at it too. But so basically, what we're trying to do is through this model, because that's really what this is a model. Um, we are able to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, with our thoughts and behavior, and we can start to notice: are we coming from our lower self right now, or are we coming from our higher self? Right now, the higher self is defined in contrast and relative to the lower self. So this is still a duality here, and if we're trying to do spiritual work to inevitably reach non-dual awareness, um, then you know essentially this model will be transcended at some point. The dichotomy between higher self and lower self. Okay, because when we're acting as the higher self, we're identifying as acting from the higher self, and that's an identity. It's kind of a paradoxical thing because, as we said, the lower self is like the ego, the self, and then the higher self is almost like the no self. So when you're acting from the higher self and you're kind of identified and identifying yourself as such, um, it's kind of paradoxical because you're identifying yourself as a no self. So you're not actually going fully non-dual there. Sorry, non-dual. Um, and that doesn't mean that this model isn't useful, especially when you're first starting to get traction um, with being more self-aware and conscious. But I think that people take the higher self and they sometimes can take the concept of higher self and then say that's my true self. Your true self isn't no self. That's still a concept. Your true self isn't a no self because that's not logically coherent if you think about it. How can a self be a non-self, right? Because then if it was non-self, it wouldn't be a self, and if it was a self, it wouldn't be a non-self. So really, eventually, if you really transcend the ego, so to speak, just by being disillusioned by the belief of the ego, which is rather flimsy and thin, um, then the one pole of that dichotomy disappears, right? So you got on one side, you got the higher self, the other side, you got the lower self. also known as the ego. Well, you dissolve the ego or you transcend the ego to the point where you become disillusioned. Now this whole pole is gone, and now your higher self isn't a higher self anymore because uh, there's no opposite. It becomes non-dual because there's no opposite, and then it loses its own meaning. So no self, because no self only has meaning in contrast to self. So if there's no contrast, then what's between self and no self? Because either one's a belief. If you believe that you're a no self, there's uh Im, implicitly a self that believes that they're a no self. Who's the believer, right? The believer is the ego. It's the lower self. The lower self believes it's the higher self. It's very tricky, paradoxical, and counterintuitive. So there's a leap where the the lower self sort of just kind of mm, it becomes thinner and thinner and thinner as you become more and more aware and disillusioned by it. But then there comes a point where it becomes so thin that both sides just disappear. And then there's no self and there's no not self. There's no self and there's no self. There's no concept. If you like this video, then please hit the like button. If you want to see more content like this, then please hit the subscribe button. If you have anything you want to say, then please comment down below. If you know anybody who might like this, then please share it. And if you want to get notifications when I drop new content, then please hit the little bell button. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.